periphery and another is central. So based on the locations of the receptor, this was peripheral chemoreceptor and central chemoreceptor. So what we have seen in peripheral chemoreceptors are sensitive to low oxygen level, right? PO2 is less, arterial PO2 is less, right? Whereas central chemoreceptor was sensitive to carbon dioxide and H plus ion. So what we have seen, the central chemoreceptors are sensitive and there is a higher level of carbon dioxide, arterial carbon dioxide, and higher case the condition was different. In one case the level of oxygen was less, and in another case the concentration of carbon dioxide or pressure of carbon dioxide was more than optimum. So our respiratory systems has to maintain proper ventilations, but to maintain the proper ventilations means it needs to maintain the proper amount of both the carbon dioxide as well as the oxygen, right? So what we have seen in peripheral chemoreceptors, there are some special type of cells, right? That is called as glomus cells, which is basically located onto carotid bodies, right? As well as aortic bodies. Most important types of glomus cells or glomus cells mainly regulates the ventilation process by changing some ionic concentration inside of the glomus cell as well as by changing some potential across the cell membrane. So what we have seen, the glomus cells are protected by some other cells called type 2 cells, and glomus cell was the type 1 cells, right? When the level of oxygen or arterial oxygen was less than normal, the special type of ion channel presence in the glomus cell membranes behaves in different way. In normal conditions, the special type of ion channel is oxygen sensitive potassium ion channel that is present in the membrane of the glomus cells. In normal conditions, it is open, right? So it allows both the entry as well as exit in optimum state. But when there is a low oxygen levels in artery, it closes, right? Which prevents the efflux of potassium ion, right? So the efflux of potassium ion or reductions in the efflux of potassium ion leads to increase in the concentration of potassium ion inside the cell, right? So as you know, the potassium ion carries some positive charges. It means if there is no efflux of positive charged potassium ion, so that there will be more positive ion inside the cells, right? More positivity inside the cells. So due to balance, imbalance inside and outside of the glomus cell membranes, the cells become depolarized, right? Because the inner membrane potentials was more than the outer membrane potential. So it creates the depolarizations. So due to the depolarizations of the glomus cells, there is a opening of another important ion channel. We have already mentioned the things. That channel is the calcium ion channel. And these calcium ion channels are very much sensitive to the state of depolarizations. Due to the depolarizations, there is a opening of calcium ion channel which allows more and more number of positively charged calcium ion, right? So what is the features of calcium ion inside the glomus cell? The features is it facilitates the movements of synaptic vesicles, right? That is present inside the glomus cell, right? So once calcium enters into the cells, it facilitates the vesicular movements towards the membrane of the glomus cell, right? Once the vesicles moves towards the membrane of the glomus cells by the process of exocytosis, it releases the material that was present inside the vesicles. So what are the materials? The materials are nothing. These are different type of neurotransmitters. The most important type of neurotransmitter was dopamine, along with acid, and other different type of neurotransmitter is there inside the synaptic vesicles, which is now released to the cleft, right? Once the neurotransmitter released to the cleft, the specific neurotransmitters will bind to the surface membranes of the glossopharyngeal nerves, right? Because in the end plate there is some specific receptors. They receive the specific neurotransmitter only, right? Here, the most important type of receptor presence was D2 dopamine receptors. So, dopamine molecule receptors will bind with the dopamine neurotransmitters, right? So ultimately, once dopamine binds to the specific receptors, these dopamine chemicals converted into neuronal impulse, right? And this impulse ultimately reach to the higher center. Then higher centers means the dorsal part of the brainstem or medulla oblongata, right? Because the medulla regions is the most important part that regulates both the rate and depth of breathing. Means it regulates the ventilations. So once the nerve fiber carries the impulse, once the glossopharyngeal or vagus nerve fiber carries the impulse to the higher center decides about the rate of ventilations. So the decisions is totally depends on the concentration of oxygen here. Whether level of oxygen is less or more. As we have mentioned that the glomus cells only act during the low level of PO2. So here ultimately there will be more ventilations. The rate of ventilations will be low as well as depth of ventilations will be high, so that the sufficient amount of oxygen can inhale and the body cells will get sufficient amount of oxygen for cellular respirations. This was about the peripheral or mode of actions of peripheral chemoreceptors, right? At the same time, we have also discussed about the role of central chemoreceptors. So central chemoreceptors are sensitive to the higher carbon dioxide level as well as the H+R concentrations. The most important features of central chemoreceptors is the central chemoreceptors are mainly sensitive to H+ ion, right? But what we have seen, the H+ ions cannot penetrate the blood-brain barrier, right? But carbon dioxide molecule easily can penetrate the blood-brain barrier. So, as carbon dioxide molecules can cross the blood-brain barrier, it enters into the CSF. So, in CSF, carbon dioxide react with the H+ ion, right? In presence of certain enzymes. So, the name of the enzymes is carbonic anhydrase, right? And it produces carbonic acid, which dissociates into H+ ion and HCO3 minus ion. So these H+ ion presence in the CSF or the concentration of H+ ions presence in the CSF is recognized by our central chemoreceptor molecules. So as the concentrations of H+ ion in CSF is more here means the pH level is low, as well as the carbon dioxide concentrations is in CSF is high. Our higher centers Now again will change its pattern of breathings to fulfill or to revert back the optimum concentration of carbon dioxide in arterial blood. So this was just a brief about the role of both the chemoreceptors or central chemoreceptors as well as the peripheral chemoreceptors, right? Now, here the central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors are not the only receptors which involves with the regulations. If we see the regulatory process, we will find there is different other regulatory processes, mainly the neural regulations, right? The neural regulations and chemical regulations, they are linked to each other, right? They are linked to each other. But here we will discuss about what are the most important part of our CNS that regulates our breathing process. We will discuss what is the name of pacemaker. What is the name of the pacemaker that involves the neural regulations of respirations? Here, the neural regulation of respirations involves our brainstem, right? In brainstem, as most of us know, the brainstem contains two important parts that play an important role in neural regulation process. One is our pons, right? And another one is medulla, right? Here, both the pons and medulla contains some respiratory center, right? Both the pons and medulla contains some respiratory center, and those respiratory centers actually involves with the neural regulation of respirations. Now, thing is, what are the different type of respiratory centers present in both the pons and medulla, and how they regulates the breathing process? See, this is the pons area, right? And this part is the medullary regions of brainstem, right? If you see the structures of pons area as well as the structures of medullary regions, you will find some respiratory centers. The respiratory centers that are present in the medullary regions are called dorsal respiratory group or DRG, right? At the same time, in the medullary regions, another respiratory group that is present in ventrolateral part of the medulla is called ventral respiratory group or DRG. So here both the dorsal respiratory group or dorsal respiratory neuron and ventral respiratory groups involved with the breathing mechanisms. Here, DRG mainly regulates the inspiratory process. There is no involvement of DRG in expiratory process, right? Whereas the ventral respiratory groups regulates both the inspiration and expirations. If I want to say more specifically, we can say the ventral respiratory groups mainly involve with the regulation of forceful breathing process, or forceful respirations, mainly the expirations. It means GRG in generally it involves with the inspiration as well as expirations. More specifically, you can say it involves with the forceful expiratory process, whereas the dorsal respiratory groups involved with the inspiratory process, right? I'll explain how both the DRG and GRG involve the inspiration and expirations. Now, another important thing is here the pons regions also contain some neuronal cells, right? What are these neuronal cells or respiratory neuron? These are pneumotaxic center and apneustic center, right? See here the upper part of the pons is called pneumotaxic center and the lower part of the pons is called apneustic centers, right? If you see the functional features of both the pneumotaxic and apneustic, it is just opposite. So how? See the pneumotaxic center, which is the upper part of the pons, mainly inhibit the activity of the lower part of the pons, so called the activity of apneustic center. Am I clear? So it is apneustic center, it is pneumotaxic center, right? As I mentioned, what is the mode of actions of this pneumotaxic center? The mode of action is it inhibits the activity of apneustic center, right? Now question is, what is the role or what is the function of apneustic center? The apneustic centers or the lower part of the pons mainly involve with the or it stimulate the inspiratory area of dorsal respiratory group, right? As I mentioned, the dorsal respiratory group mainly involved with the inspiratory process. Now see, what is the role of apneustic center here? Apneustic centers or the lower part of the pons stimulate the inspiratory center of dorsal respiratory group. That means it facilitates the inspiration, right? It facilitates the inspirations. It helps to increase the rate of breathing as well as the depth of breathing. But here the pneumotaxic centers prevents the activity of apneustic center. So it means the pneumotaxic center switch off the inspiration and expiration process, ultimately helps to maintain the balance between the rate of respirations as well as the depth of respirations. How? Suppose the apneustic centers constantly stimulate the inspiratory area of dorsal respiratory group. So due to that stimulation, dorsal respiratory or inspiratory center of dorsal respiratory group will facilitate the prolonged inspiration, less expiration, right? It is called apneosis. It is called apneosis. So what is apneosis? Apneosis means the prolonged inspirations, short expirations. So how to improve or how to maintain the normal rate? So here, now these pneumotaxic centers played an important role by inhibiting the action of apneustic center, so that it will not be able to stimulate the inspiratory center presence in the dorsal respiratory group and ultimately helps to maintain the rate or ultimately helps to prevent the apneosis. Means by inhibiting the action of apneustic centers, it's ultimately maintain the rate of respirations as well as depth of respirations. Now, here, if you see the medullary regions, the medullary regions contains another important part other than dorsal respiratory groups and ventral respiratory groups. The name of that part is pre-Böttinger complex. Pre-Böttinger complex. So what is the specialty of pre-Böttinger complex? The pre-Böttinger complex mainly involved with the initiation of respirations, means it acts as a rhythmic center, it acts as a pacemaker, right? Our dorsal respiratory group or neuron presence in dorsal respiratory group cannot initiate the inspirations. Instead, the initiation of respirations is controlled by a pacemaker of our respiratory system. The name of that pacemaker is Böttinger complex, which is located into the either side of the medullary regions, right? Now, we'll explain how this pre-Böttinger complex initiates the respirations and how it controls the overall breathing mechanisms. See, our inspiratory center or the inspiratory center presence in the dorsal group, after initiation of inspirations, it maintains for a particular period of time, right? At the initial point of time, the inspirations is quick, right? It gradually increases, right? And ceases abruptly. It means two different phases is there. At the initial point of time, the rate of inspiration is very minimum, right? Initially or gradually it increases for a certain period of time. So what is that time? That time is around 2 seconds, right? And then ceases abruptly, right? It is called excellent. And after the sessions, maybe I'll ask some random questions about the locations of different group of neuron. See, as I mentioned, the role of pneumotaxic center and apneustic center. We also can see, as I mentioned, the two area, right? The dorsal area, which is basically involved with the inspiration, as well as you can see the ventral part. Here, this nerve fiber, you already know about that. These are both the vagus and glossopharyngeal. They are nerve fiber that originates from the periphery, right? And ultimately they reaches to the center, and center decides about the rate and depth of respirations. That is totally depends on the stimulus that is received by vagus and glossopharyngeal. See, this is the motor pathway. Motor pathway means after having the decisions, it sends the signals via motor neurons to the effector organ like muscles, so that muscles can contract, like diaphragm can contract, right? So it is respiratory motor pathway. Now, see, yes, this one, pre-Purkinje complex. So what is the specialty? The specialty is, it's like a pacemaker of the heart, but here it is the pacemaker of our respiratory systems, and this complex is located on either side of the medulla, that is between the nucleus of MBBS and lateral reticularis, and they generate the rhythm of respirations. So this is the very basic concept about the pre-Purkinje complex. If you see the recent update about the Purkinje complex, initially it was known that the not the pre-Purkinje complex, it is the Purkinje complex that regulates the respirations. But recent updates about the research, they show not the Purkinje complex, it is the pre-Purkinje complex which initiates the respiratory process, or you can say which acts as a pacemaker of our respiratory systems. Now from these figures you can see how this pre-Purkinje complex involves with the regulatory mechanisms, right? Here from the inspiratory area, that is the inspiratory area. So inspiratory area is the dorsal area or dorsal respiratory groups. It sends the motor impulses to a diaphragm by the phrenic nerve. Similarly, you also can see there is some other nerve fibers. These are the motor nerve fibers or intercostals that enters into the intercostal muscles, or they ultimately help to improve the rate of contractions of external intercostal muscles, that is required for the proper ventilation process. Other than this, here you can see, other than peripheral receptors, there is some other receptors from where our respiratory centers can be stimulated. See, from the stress receptors, the nerve fibers ultimately reach to the center, that is the DRG, dorsal respiratory groups, and this DRG sends the impulses to the cerebral cortex area, right? See, here the things that I am going to discuss is this one, or RAM signals. So what is RAM signals? So the most important properties of the RAM signals is the initial point of time, the rate of inspirations is very weak, right? And steadily increase or rises, right? And then decline or ceases abruptly. So if you plot the diagrams about the RAM signals, you'll find this, right? So the time required to complete this phase is around 2 seconds, right? After that, there is sharp fall, right? And this is the expiratory time. This is the inspiratory time, right? The expiratory time is around 3 seconds. So it continues. After completion of this phase, again there is a sharp increase, right? Or gradual increase and sharp decline, right? So this mode of respirations can be explained by RAM signal. If I want to brief about the things that I have discussed till now from the neural regulation of respirations, I can brief in this way. The neural respirations or neural regulation of respirations are mainly of two types. One is voluntary control and another one is involuntary control. Voluntary control means it is our wish, right? We easily can control the rate as well as depth of breathing, like breath holding, right? The most important neural centers presence which involves the voluntary control of respirations is cerebral cortex. From cerebral cortex, it sends the neuronal impulse to motor neurons, so corticospinal tract in the effective organ. Now this is the voluntary part. the most important thing is involuntary parts. So what we have discussed in the involuntary parts, the most important part involved is our brainstem, where the most important region is pons and medullary regions. So what is the features of the pons and medulla? The features is pons contains two centers called pneumotoxic centers, which is present in the upper portions of the pons, and the lower portions of the pons there is a apneustic centers. So what is the functions of both the pneumotoxic and apneustic? Pneumotoxic centers inhibits the activity of apneustic center, means it acts as a feedback systems to regulate the respirations. Whereas apneustic centers is the centers which stimulate the inspiratory center present in the dorsal respiratory group. Right? Now, if you see the medullary regions, in the medullary regions, there are mainly two group of neurons, right? That are dorsal respiratory group or DRG and ventral respiratory groups. The dorsal respiratory groups are present in the dorsal side, and ventral respiratory group are present in ventrolateral part of the medulla. So, what is the functions of dorsal and ventral? The dorsal area is mainly involved with the inspiratory process. There is no involvement of expiratory process. There is no involvement of dorsal respiratory groups in expiratory process. Whereas the ventral respiratory groups mainly involved with the inspiration and expirations. More specifically, it is involved with the regulation of forceful expirations. Now, here the action of both the pons and medullary regions is under the actions of someone else. So, who is that part? That part is the pacemaker. So, what is the name of that pacemaker? The name of that pacemaker says P-Bodginger complex or P-Bodginger complex, right? So, where it is located? It is located just above the dorsal as well as ventral respiratory group, right? In either side of the medulla. It acts as a pacemaker or it acts as a rhythmic center. It involves the generation of respiratory rhythm, right? Now, what I've discussed that the rate of respirations as well as the depth of respirations depends on under certain conditions. The conditions means about the stimulus. Our respiratory center or the actions of our respiratory centers depends on the nature of stimulus, right? So, what are the different natures of the stimulus? Natures of the stimulus are the changes in chemical concentrations, like changes in the carbon dioxide concentration, changes in the oxygen level, changes in the exposure concentrations, right? So, based on the nature of stimuli, our higher center decides how to perform, right? What we have seen on the level of oxygen in case of chemical regulations, and there is the low level of oxygen concentrations, chemoreceptors excites response. Based on the response of chemoreceptors, our dorsal respiratory groups improve the rate of ventilation. It means whether it is chemical regulations or neural regulations, in both cases, the response by particular respiratory centers depends on the nature of stimulus. So here, two more things I have discussed. That is about the apneosis. So what is apneosis? It is the prolonged inspiratory rate. So when it happens when our dorsal respiratory groups continuously maintains the inspirations only. So here the activity of the dorsal respiratory group is controlled by apneustic centers. It means if apneustic centers continuously sends the positive stimulus to inspiratory centers of dorsal respiratory group, it will continuously maintains the inspirations only, called prolonged inspirations, right? Which is not a normal state. It is apneistic state that can be regulated by the action of pneumotoxic centers. So what is the role of pneumotoxic here? It sends the negative stimuli to the apneistic centers to regulate the inspiratory or activity of inspiratory area present in the dorsal respiratory group, right? Another important thing that I mentioned, that RAM signals. So what is RAM signals? RAM signals is, if you see our breathing pattern, at the initial point of time, the rate of breathing or rate of inspirations is very, very minimum. It is 0. It gradually increases. So the gradual increase of time required, a time of gradual increase is around 2 seconds, right? Suddenly it declines, right? So this is a pattern of gradual incline called inspiratory rate as abruptly fall down, and after that for 3 seconds it maintains the expiration, and again the same thing continues. It is called RAM signals. These RAM signals is regulated by the rhythm centers. The rhythm centers, that is the pre-Wardinger complex, that is present in the dorsal respiratory group. So this is just a brief about both the chemical regulations as well as the neural regulations. This is about the gist how both the pontine respiratory regions and medullary respiratory regions equally involved in the regulation of rate of breathing as well as the depth of breathing, that ultimately helps to maintain the concentration of gases. So this is just basic. Now if you have any queries, you can ask.